I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Sylvia Lechner, who I've known for a little while now. She was for some time a lecturer in the Department of War Studies at King's College London, where she remains a senior visiting research fellow, but now she's running the show at the Anglo-American University in Prague. So on to bigger and better things. She's a political theorist. That's how you described yourself downstairs, so that's what I'm going to go with an interest in international law and ethics and all sorts of things, the philosophy of social science. She is an award-winning author of books and articles that range from Hobbes, as we'll hear today, to the ethics of technology and critiques of late modernity. And if I'm honest, a lot of it escapes me. You know, it goes over my head. But I've gathered, enough from knowing Sylvia that she is somebody who's got a very, very important perspective. And I've benefited an awful lot from listening to her, and I'm looking forward to doing it again. So it's with pleasure that I hand the floor over to you, Sylvia.
Again, I'm delighted to be here, and I would wish to thank Alan for inviting me. Because this conference is about war, I will talk about a particular vocabulary of war which emerges from early modernity with Hobbes' philosophy, but which I believe is important for political debates and for political philosophy today. And the paper is called Hobbes on War, Radical Disagreement and Public Reason. So I want to understand the relationship between the idea of radical disagreement, which is central to Hobbes' conception of modern politics, and the proposed solution, which he calls right reason, and which nowadays we call public reason. So what is public reason? Well, in modern societies, we have come to a conclusion that we cannot agree on questions of morality. These are questions of life and death, religious belief, sexuality, marriage, and so on, which are very intimate to our heart. So we have abandoned this search as a chimera, and we have decided to move into the area of law and politics. So public reason is a project which operates in the domain of law and politics, and it provides a procedure for generating agreement on the basic rules of the game in a political community. And these are rules which are expressed once again in law. They are not moral rules. So nowadays we have contemporary philosophers like John Rawls in the United States, Jürgen Habermas in Germany, and they basically would tell us that public reason should work towards consensus. And in this paper, I want to attend to an alternative conception of public reason, which I find much more interesting philosophically, which derives from Hobbes and which is not based on consensus, but which is antagonistic. And I start, in order to elucidate this problem, with Hobbes' conception of war, of all against all, which I'm sure you have heard about. So what is this conception exactly? It's not a state of barbarism. It's not some sort of a pre-social condition. The state of nature is a legal vacuum. It's a state in which there is no sovereign political authority, and in which you have a multitude of individuals who are all independent and equal. They're not equal across the board, they're equal in their physical vulnerability. And Hobbes tells us that under such conditions in which there is no overarching sovereign authority, free and equal individuals will inevitably end up trying to harm each other. And that is the famous state of war, which has been prominent in realist political theory, right? Which describes the relationships of states in the international realm. However, Hobbes is a much more interesting thinker because he realized that the state of war is not a state of the world, it's a state of the mind. So what kind of state it is? It's a state of anticipation. I anticipate something bad, something harmful to happen to me in the future. Now, the state of war has to be distinguished from the state of nature, which is a much broader concept. And actually, Hobbes doesn't distinguish them very clearly, but they're distinct concepts. And the state of nature simply means an interaction domain in which people interact in the absence of settled rules. Yeah? So that is a state of nature. Both concepts include uncertainty. State of war includes uncertainty in terms of anticipation of harm. State of nature includes much more fundamental forms of uncertainty. the key among which is transactional uncertainty. So basically, in the state of nature, you have contracts and promises which are uncertain. And so far, it seems as if we have a hopeless business, but Hobbes, with certain bravura, says, hey, we can find convenient articles of peace, which are discovered by what? By reason. So they're not discovered through custom, through history, they're discovered through reason. And these convenient rules are the laws of nature, and they exist in the state of nature. So these are some hypothetical imperatives which say, if you want to survive in the state of nature, don't be proud, try to fit in, be grateful, and so on. So if you keep these rules, theoretically, you should put uncertainty at bay. But Hobbes goes on to say, unfortunately, that doesn't work. The laws of nature get us further, but not far enough. Why? Because they are themselves uncertain, and therefore they cannot arrest uncertainty. Why are they uncertain? Imagine that you and I in the state of nature, and we have made a contract, which means that we keep the rule, make contracts, and keep contracts in the state of nature. Now we make a contract, you're late with your delivery. I start to dispute your position. I say you broke the contract. And there is no judge, because we're in the state of nature, to settle our dispute. And that's how the problem of public reason emerges. So in chapter 5 of Leviathan, Hobbes is saying, if we have a state of radical disagreement being one possible conceptualization of the state of nature, then we need reason to solve it. However, and that's the trick, we don't need the reason of any one of us, we need the reason of some third party or arbitrator. And this third party or arbitrator is the source of right reason. Now, so far, so good. Now, we would expect Hobbes to tell us that public reason is qualitatively different from private reason, but that's not what he's saying. He's saying everybody is crazy and stupid, and everyone's reason is fallible. The reason of one person, the reason of collectivity of person is also fallible. So we have a problem. So let's see where this argument leads us. So what is reason? Reason is simply an abstract computation of images or objects of certain abstract mental representations. And it basically operates, like I call it here, like a syllogistic chain. So you move from premises to conclusions. That's what Hobbes thinks it is. In any case, in philosophy, that's called theoretical reason rather than practical reason. So why should we bother with public reason? Because public reason, once again, promises a means for ending controversy. And Hobbes says, I'm sorry because I can't see very well. And therefore, as when there is a controversy in an account, the parties must, by their own accord, set up for right reason the reason of some arbitrator or judge to whose sentence they will both stand, and their controversy might either come to blows or be left undecided. Now, Hobbes tells us that right reason doesn't exist in nature. So nobody by nature has right reason. It exists artificially through human agreement. So human agreement creates civil law, and civil law in turn determines what is right reason. Now, why do we need that? Because in order to stop a dispute, we need a conclusive sentence by an arbitrator, and that's a juridical function, and not just any arbitrator, but an absolutely final arbitrator, or the sovereign. And that's the beauty of Hobbes' solution. He's saying, look, the sovereign is not a genius. His, if it's a person, reason is as fallible as the reason of anybody else. However, the status of this reason is different. Why? Because it derives from the highest possible source of authority, and that is state authority. Yeah? And that's why Hobbes has a theory of sovereignty. So I now move to the mechanism and form of public reason. That's a trodden path, nothing interesting here. Basically, people or individuals in the state of nature agree, they make a social contract through which they authorize a particular person or office to be their sovereign. And what they do effectively, they say, from now on, I will step away and I will decide to give up part of my autonomy and my will to you, to the sovereign. So from now on, you exercise this will in place of me. Yeah? and you exercise your judgment, notice that, or your reason in place of mine. That's what, in this aspect at least, the authorization of the sovereign achieves. And that's why it's very important for us to understand that Hobbes is not talking about crude power, but he's talking about authority and authorization, because this transfer of will and reason can only come through the will of the individual subject. It cannot be enforced. Now, Hobbes has so far has made 2 inroads. He has told us something about the will, the act of willing, which is intending to do something. And he has also told us something about reason, which is an inferential capacity. I infer conclusions from premises. The problem is that these are 2 different things. Will is part of the world of action, where I will to bring about some state of affairs. And reason is part of the world of belief. Its structure is theoretical. So how do you bring them together? And Hobbes says through language. Why? Because I can use language to utter statements of will and to give a linguistic expression to reason. And if you look at his definition of reason, where he says reason is computation or reckoning, as Hobbes calls it, it's not just a reckoning, but reckoning with the consequences of general terms agreed upon. So if you recall the example with the laws of nature, where people disagreed, right? There was an example of a state of nature or radical disagreement. And Hobbes says, listen, people simply evaluate things differently, but that's not per se the problem. The problem is when they articulate these disagreements openly. In other words, if I think that my boss is a fool, but I keep quiet, that's okay. The problem begins if I articulate my ideas openly. So, in other words, people disagree primarily because they attach different meanings to the same words. And in this context, and that's the final move in Hobbes' argument, you need the sovereign to step in to authoritatively attach fixed meaning to a certain vocabulary. Now, of course, the sovereign is not the source of language, which is based on convention and so on, but the sovereign fixes the meanings of only those basic legal terms which define legal relations in a political community, terms for property, rights, freedom under the law, and stuff like that. So with that, Hobbes' argument is complete. Do I have more time? Mm-hmm. So I will just want to go through the conclusion in a little bit more detail. So we saw that the journey of public reason in Hobbes' modern philosophy began first by noting the inferential power of reasoning, some sort of a logical mechanism, if you want. Then we moved through the need, by using public reason, to reconcile differences between free and equal beings. And finally, we arrived at the medium of civil law, which fixes statuses and positions, which was propped up by linguistic determination through language. So the big conclusion which Hobbes is drawing in his philosophy is that the civil law is the only avenue for preventing individuals who pursue self-chosen goals from clashing with each other. And the core thesis of my paper, which I just presented in a very bare outline, is that the background condition for the derivation of public reason is Hobbes' understanding of war. So it has 2 major denominations. In one understanding, war, as we have seen, is a state of nature, or more specifically, a state of war. That is, I think, the less interesting, philosophically speaking, concept. But there is another parallel notion of war, which simply refers to radical disagreement. And that is the condition which we encounter in modern societies. Even nowadays, we have radical disagreement. We don't have consensus anymore. So how does Hobbes explain that? He uses his theory of moral psychology on the one side and his theory of the good, which is a normative theory. So here is what he says about moral psychology. And diverse men differ not only in their judgment on the senses of what is pleasant and unpleasant, in the taste, smell, hearing, touch, and sight, but also of what is comfortable or disagreeable to reason. So everybody is crazy in their own way. People simply are driven by divergent desires. They're simply energized by different stuff. And the second move, which is slightly different, is that Hobbes goes on to explain that through his theory of subjective good. So what is the difference between desire and good? Well, desire is a brute fact. It's like in economic theory. When you say I have desires or preferences, but I don't judge them, I simply accept them as a brute fact. If you, however, talk about good, you're simply saying that certain desires are worth having. So you're making a normative pronouncement, and that's what Hobbes is talking about. And he goes on to say, I will not bore you with the quote, but he says, everybody attaches his own subjective notion of good to whatever he likes or she likes. So there is no objective good. Hobbes is not Kant. So in both of these passages, which I just barely mentioned, Hobbes is telling us that the good is subjective, that reason is fallible, and that therefore human desire as a natural propeller of human action, or natural reason found in nature, in naturally existing individuals, is not going to help us to manage our disagreements. Yeah? So we have to look for a different route. And Hobbes' genius, it seems to me, is that he identifies the problem correctly. He's saying the problem doesn't lie in the fact of divergent desires and hopes, but in the opinions or judgments which we attach to these desires. For if things which seem good to somebody actually count as good, then we are no longer in the realm of truth, but we are in the realm of opinion. And we can see that nowadays in contemporary politics, where everything is opinion. It's doxa. Yeah? So therefore, public reason cannot be a mechanism, as some Habermasians or Rawlsians will tell us, for searching for some form of a basic truth or consensus. Public reason should and must remain a project of radical disagreement. So in other words, yes, Hobbes says we can manage, we can design some thin set of rules, but these are really rules of coexistence. So that's a warlike metaphor. These are not thick agreements over substantive goods, because that is what it means to be modern. In other words, we are destined to live with, as Derrida would put it, with the condition of war. And we shouldn't try to abolish it, because that would be a chimera.